Sometimes the person everyone counted out becomes the one who counts the most. Sometimes the kid who ate lunch alone in the corner becomes the man who commands respect in boardrooms. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice arrives not in a courtroom, but in the thunderous roar of helicopter blades cutting through a crisp October evening. This is the story of Marcus Chun, a man who turned his deepest humiliation into his greatest triumph. A man who proved that the measure of success isn't where you start, but how far you're willing to climb when the whole world tells you to stay down. What happened at Westfield High's 10-year reunion didn't just silence a room full of former bullies. It redefined what victory really looks like. The story begins with a reunion invitation that most people would have thrown away. But Marcus wasn't most people. He had spent 10 years building something extraordinary from the ashes of his teenage years, and he was about to show everyone exactly what they had missed. Marcus Chun stared at the crumpled reunion invitation on his kitchen counter, the golden embossed letters of Westfield High Class of 2014 catching the morning light. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he couldn't seem to move away from the piece of paper that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The same piece of paper he had thrown in the trash twice, only to fish it out again in moments of what he wasn't sure was courage or masochism. 10 years. Had it really been that long since he walked across that stage, diploma in hand, swearing to himself he would never look back? 10 years since he had escaped the daily torment that had defined his high school experience. 10 years since he had been anything other than successful, respected, and genuinely happy. So why did this simple invitation make his stomach twist the same way it had when he was 17 and facing another day in the halls of Westfield High? The memories came flooding back, uninvited and unwelcome. Marcus remembered his first day as a sophomore, when his family had moved to the affluent suburb of Westfield after his father's job transfer. He had walked into that school with hope, excited about the fresh start, the chance to reinvent himself. What he found instead was a social hierarchy so rigid and unforgiving that it made medieval class systems look progressive. Marcus had 3 strikes against him from the moment he stepped foot in Westfield High. First, he was Asian in a school that was overwhelmingly white and unconsciously suspicious of anyone who looked different. Second, his family wasn't wealthy by Westfield standards. While his parents both worked respectable jobs, his mother as a nurse, his father as an engineer, they couldn't afford the luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive vacations that seemed to be prerequisites for acceptance in this particular corner of suburban America. Third, and perhaps most damning of all, Marcus was genuinely intelligent and unashamed of it. In a school where academic achievement was seen as social suicide unless you were already popular, Marcus's straight A's and love of learning marked him as an outsider. The bullying started small, as these things always do. Snide comments about his weird lunch that his grandmother packed with love, traditional Korean dishes that smelled different from the cafeteria pizza, and hamburgers his classmates ate. Jokes about his last name, mispronounced deliberately by kids who could pronounce far more complex names of European origin without difficulty. Eye rolls when he answered questions in class, as if his knowledge was somehow an affront to their carefully cultivated image of casual indifference. But small cruelties have a way of growing into larger ones, especially when they meet no resistance from authority figures who are supposed to protect. The comments became louder, more public. His backpack would mysteriously disappear, only to be found in a trash can or, memorably, hanging from the school flagpole. Someone created a fake social media account in his name, posting embarrassing photos and messages designed to humiliate him further. The account gained hundreds of followers before it was finally taken down, but not before screenshots had been shared throughout the school. The ringleader of Marcus's torment was Brad Hutchinson, a golden-haired quarterback whose father owned the largest construction company in 3 counties. Brad had the kind of effortless popularity that seemed to bend reality around it. Teachers loved him despite his mediocre grades. Girls fought for his attention despite his obvious lack of substance. Boys wanted to be him despite his casual cruelty to anyone he deemed beneath his notice. And Marcus, unfortunately, had caught Brad's attention in the worst possible way. It started when Marcus had been paired with Brad for a chemistry project during junior year. Marcus had done most of the work, as he usually did in group projects, but when it came time to present, Brad had taken all the credit. When Marcus had quietly pointed out the error to their teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, after class, Brad had been forced to share the grade. That night, Marcus's locker had been vandalized with a spray-painted slur that took the maintenance crew 3 days to remove completely. The incident had escalated from there. Brad seemed to take Marcus's existence as a personal challenge, a problem that needed to be solved through systematic humiliation. He would accidentally bump into Marcus in the hallways, sending his books flying. He would make loud comments about Marcus's clothes, his appearance, his family's car in the parking lot. Worst of all, he would do it all with a smile, in a tone that could almost be interpreted as friendly, making it nearly impossible for Marcus to report without sounding paranoid or oversensitive. The low point came during the spring of senior year, just 2 months before graduation. Marcus had been elected to the National Honor Society, one of only 12 students in his class to receive the recognition. The induction ceremony was held in the school auditorium, with parents and family members invited to watch their children receive their certificates and NHS pins. Marcus's parents had taken time off work. His grandmother had driven 3 hours from the city, and his younger sister had convinced her middle school to let her leave early to attend. As Marcus walked across the stage to receive his certificate, Brad and his friends, seated in the back of the auditorium, began to slow clap. Not loud enough to disrupt the ceremony officially, but loud enough that everyone could hear it. Everyone knew what it meant. Other students began to snicker. Some pulled out their phones to record. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, tried to focus on his family's proud faces in the third row, but the heat of humiliation burned through his chest like acid. After the ceremony, as families gathered in the lobby for refreshments, Brad approached Marcus's family with his practiced golden boy smile. He introduced himself to Marcus's parents as their son's good friend, told them how lucky they would have such a special son. The words were perfectly innocent on the surface, but the tone, the emphasis, the knowing looks from his friends nearby, it all combined to turn what should have been a celebration into another moment of quiet shame. That night, Marcus had locked himself in his bedroom and made a decision that would shape the next decade of his life. He wouldn't just escape Westfield High. He would transform himself so completely that when he inevitably encountered these people again, they wouldn't recognize the scared, humiliated teenager they had left behind. He would become someone so successful, so confident, so undeniably accomplished that their opinions would become irrelevant. He would win not by confronting them, but by becoming someone they could never touch. The next morning, Marcus threw himself into preparation for his future with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had already been accepted to Stanford with a partial academic scholarship, but now he researched every opportunity the university offered. He applied for additional scholarships, summer research programs, internships, anything that would set him apart. He read business books, studied successful entrepreneurs, and began to map out not just a career, but an empire. His parents worried about him during those final weeks of high school. Marcus had always been driven, but now he seemed to exist in a state of constant motion, as if sitting still meant risking the return of those feelings of powerlessness he had carried for so long. He barely spoke about school, about his classmates, about the daily social dynamics that had once caused him so much pain. Instead, he talked about the future with a certainty and focus that was both inspiring and slightly unsettling. Graduation day arrived like a finish line Marcus had been sprinting toward for 4 years. He sat with the other National Honor Society members, watched Brad give a speech as class president that was full of empty phrases about friendship and memories and staying in touch. Marcus felt nothing as he watched his former tormentors toss their caps in the air and embrace tearfully as if their high school years had been the best of their lives rather than a systematic campaign of psychological warfare against anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. After the ceremony, as families took photos and made plans for graduation parties, Marcus slipped away quietly. He didn't attend any of the celebrations, didn't exchange contact information with classmates who suddenly seemed interested in being friendly now that high school was ending. Instead, he went home, packed his belongings methodically, and began the process of becoming someone entirely new. His mother found him that night, sitting on his bed surrounded by boxes, staring at his diploma. She sat beside him without saying anything for a long moment, understanding instinctively that this was a turning point, not just an ending. "You know," she finally said in the gentle tone she had always used when Marcus was hurt, "sometimes the best revenge is living well." Marcus looked at her, this woman who had watched her son suffer for years while maintaining faith that he would emerge stronger. "I'm not interested in revenge," he told her, and he meant it. "I'm interested in transformation." 3 months later, Marcus arrived at Stanford with 3 suitcases, a laptop, and a determination that would have impressed military commanders. He wasn't running away from Westfield anymore. He was running towards something so much bigger that Westfield would become nothing more than a footnote in his origin story. The last thing he did before leaving his childhood bedroom was take down the bulletin board where he had pinned his achievements throughout high school: honor roll certificates, science fair awards, college acceptance letters. At the bottom of the board, he had kept the reunion invitation as a reminder of what he was leaving behind. Now he looked at it one more time, memorizing the date, the location, the time, before crumpling it up and throwing in the trash. He had no intention of going back. At least, not yet. Not until he had built something so extraordinary that returning would be a choice, not a necessity. Not until he could walk back into that world as someone who belonged anywhere he chose to be, rather than someone desperately seeking acceptance from people whose opinions no longer mattered. As the plane lifted off from the airport, carrying Marcus toward his new life at Stanford, he pressed his face to the window and watched his hometown disappear below the clouds. Somewhere down there was Westfield High, its hallways and classrooms and cafeteria still echoing with the ghosts of teenage cruelty. But Marcus was no longer that scared, isolated boy. He was becoming someone else entirely, someone who would prove that the last laugh belongs not to the loudest voice, but to the most determined heart. Stanford University in the fall of 2014 was a different planet from Westfield High, and Marcus Chun felt the difference in every breath of California air he took. The campus sprawled under endless blue skies, filled with students who wore their intelligence like a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. Here, being smart wasn't just acceptable. It was expected, celebrated, and rewarded in ways Marcus had only dreamed about during his lonely high school years. But Marcus quickly realized that simply being smart wouldn't be enough. Stanford was filled with valedictorians, science fair winners, and academic superstars from around the world. If he wanted to truly transform himself, he would need to become more than just another brilliant student. He would need to become a leader, an innovator, someone who didn't just succeed within existing systems, but created new ones entirely. His first semester was a whirlwind of strategic positioning. Marcus didn't just attend classes, he dominated them. He didn't just complete assignments. He exceeded every expectation and then set new standards for what was possible. His computer science professors began to notice the quiet Asian freshmen who could code solutions they hadn't thought of, who asked questions that revealed gaps in their own knowledge, who approached problems with an intensity that was both impressive and slightly intimidating. But Marcus's real education was happening outside the classroom, in the dormitory common rooms where future tech billionaires debated startup ideas until 3 in the morning, in the coffee shops where venture capitalists gave informal talks about what they were looking for in the next generation of entrepreneurs. Marcus absorbed everything, studied not just the technology but the personalities, the social dynamics, the unspoken rules of Silicon Valley success. He joined the entrepreneurship club, not because he had a business idea yet, but because he needed to understand how ideas became empires. He volunteered for research projects with professors who had connections to major tech companies. He attended every guest lecture, every networking event, every opportunity to learn from people who had successfully navigated the path he was trying to create for himself. During his sophomore year, Marcus met David Park, a senior computer science student who was working on what he called the next big thing, a mobile application that would revolutionize food delivery. David was brilliant but scattered, full of ideas but lacking the focus and discipline to execute them properly. He needed a partner who could take his visions and turn them into functional reality. Marcus became that partner. They worked together for 8 months, often pulling all-nighters in the computer lab, surviving on energy drinks, and the shared conviction that they were building something important. Marcus learned to code at a level that impressed even his professors. But more importantly, he learned to think like an entrepreneur. He studied user experience design, market analysis, venture capital funding structures, everything he would need to not just build a product, but build a company. The app, called QuickBite, launched during Marcus's junior year to immediate success on the Stanford campus. Within 6 months, it had expanded to 3 other California universities. David handled the creative vision and public relations, while Marcus managed the technical development and business operations. It was Marcus who figured out how to scale their server capacity, Marcus who negotiated their first major funding round, Marcus who hired and managed their growing team of developers. By the end of junior year, QuickBite had been acquired by a major food delivery company for $2.3 million. David received the larger share as the original founder, but Marcus's portion was still substantial enough to pay off his student loans and provide seed capital for whatever came next. More importantly, the acquisition had given him something invaluable, a reputation in Silicon Valley as someone who could execute, someone who could take an idea and turn it into something real and profitable. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with being a successful employee or even a successful partner. The experience with QuickBite had shown him that he could compete with anyone in the tech world, but it had also shown him that he wanted to be the one calling the shots. During the summer between junior and senior year, while David took a celebratory vacation in Europe, Marcus began working on his own project. The idea came to him during a frustrating experience with his apartment's maintenance service. Like most college students, Marcus had dealt with landlords who were slow to respond to repair requests, contractors who showed up late or not at all, and a general sense that tenants had no real power in the rental market. But unlike most college students, Marcus had the technical skills and business knowledge to do something about it. He envisioned a platform that would connect property owners with verified, rated maintenance professionals, while giving tenants real-time updates on repair requests and the ability to rate and review their experiences. It was Uber for property maintenance, with built-in accountability systems that would revolutionize an industry that had been operating the same way for decades. Marcus spent the summer building the first version of the platform, which he called FixFlow. He coded the basic functionality himself, designed the user interface, and began reaching out to property management companies and independent contractors in the Bay Area. By the time he returned to Stanford for his senior year, he had his first pilot program running with a property management company that handled over 500 rental units. Senior year was a balancing act between completing his degree and growing his company. Marcus maintained his perfect GPA while secretly running a business that was beginning to attract serious attention from investors. He hired his first employees, 2 sophomore computer science students who worked part-time in exchange for equity and the chance to learn from someone who had already successfully sold a company. The breakthrough came during spring semester when Marcus was invited to present at Stanford's annual Demo Day, an event where student entrepreneurs showcased their projects to a panel of Silicon Valley investors and executives. Marcus had 12 minutes to present FixFlow to an audience that included partners from major venture capital firms, executives from established tech companies, and successful entrepreneurs who had once stood on the same stage. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for those 12 minutes, rehearsing not just his presentation, but his responses to every possible question, his explanation for every business decision he had made. When he walked onto the stage, he wasn't the nervous teenager who had once been humiliated at his high school award ceremony. He was a confident entrepreneur with a proven track record, a solid business plan, and the technical skills to execute his vision. The presentation was flawless. Marcus explained the problem FixFlow solved, demonstrated the technology with a live demo, presented market research showing the massive potential in the property maintenance industry, and outlined his growth strategy with the precision of someone who had thought through every detail. When he finished, the auditorium was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. The questions that followed were tough, but fair. Marcus answered each one with confidence and detail, drawing on everything he had learned during his time at Stanford and his experience with QuickBite. When one investor asked about his long-term vision for the company, Marcus didn't hesitate. Fixed flow isn't just about property maintenance, he said. It's about creating accountability and efficiency in service industries that have operated without real innovation for decades. Property maintenance is just the beginning. The same platform could revolutionize home services, commercial maintenance, even municipal infrastructure management. After the presentation, Marcus was surrounded by investors and executives wanting to learn more about his company and his background. Business cards were exchanged, meetings were scheduled, and by the end of the evening, Marcus had received preliminary interest from 3 major venture capital firms. 2 weeks later, at age 22, Marcus closed a series of funding round of $3.2 million for Fixed Flow. The lead investor was Sarah Chun, no relation, despite the shared last name, a partner at one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms who had built her reputation by identifying promising entrepreneurs early in their careers. She saw in Marcus something that reminded her of the tech industry's most successful founders, not just technical brilliance, but the rare combination of vision, execution ability, and absolute determination to succeed. Marcus graduated from Stanford magna cum laude with a degree in computer science and a minor in business administration. But more importantly, he graduated as the CEO of a rapidly growing company with serious backing and unlimited potential. At the graduation ceremony, as he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Marcus thought briefly about his high school graduation 4 years earlier, about the humiliation he had felt as Brad Hutchinson and his friends mocked his achievements. That version of himself seemed like a character from someone else's story now. The scared, isolated teenager who had counted down the days until he could escape Westfield High had been replaced by someone who belonged anywhere he chose to be, someone who created opportunities rather than waiting for them, someone who had turned his pain into power and his outsider status into a competitive advantage. After graduation, Marcus moved into a small but stylish apartment in Palo Alto, closer to Fixed Flow's new offices. The company was growing rapidly, expanding beyond the Bay Area into markets across California and beginning to explore opportunities in other states. Marcus hired experienced executives to handle areas outside his expertise, but he maintained direct control over the technical development and strategic direction of the company. The work was demanding, often requiring 16-hour days and constant problem-solving as the company scaled. But Marcus thrived under the pressure. Every challenge was an opportunity to prove himself. Every success was evidence that he had been right to believe in his ability to transform himself completely. He was building something that mattered, something that created value and solved real problems for real people. By the end of his first year as a Stanford graduate, Fixed Flow had processed over 10,000 service requests, partnered with property management companies in 12 cities, and built a network of more than 500 verified contractors. The company was profitable, growing, and beginning to attract acquisition interest from major players in the real estate and technology industries. Marcus had also begun to develop the personal confidence that had always eluded him during his high school years. Success in business had given him a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. He dated occasionally, developed friendships with other entrepreneurs and Stanford alumni, and began to see himself as someone who belonged in the world he was creating rather than someone fighting to prove he deserved to be there. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had developed a clear vision for his future that extended far beyond Fixed Flow. He could see himself building multiple companies, investing in other entrepreneurs, maybe even teaching or mentoring students who reminded him of his younger self. He could see a future where his high school years were nothing more than the origin story of someone who had gone on to achieve extraordinary things. Sometimes, late at night in his office, Marcus would allow himself to imagine what his former classmates were doing. Brad Hutchinson was probably working for his father's construction company, living the same life in the same town he had always known. The other students who had participated in or ignored his humiliation were probably following similarly predictable paths: local colleges, local jobs, local concerns that had never expanded beyond the borders of their small world. Marcus felt no anger toward them anymore, only a kind of distant pity. They had peaked in high school, living in a world where being cruel to someone different made them feel powerful. But Marcus had discovered that real power came from building something meaningful, from creating value, from proving that intelligence and determination could overcome any temporary disadvantage. As his second year out of Stanford began, Marcus started receiving invitations to speak at entrepreneurship conferences, to serve as a guest lecturer at universities, to share his story with other young people who might be facing their own challenges. He always accepted these opportunities, not because he needed the recognition, but because he remembered what it felt like to be isolated and different, and he wanted other outsiders to know that their differences could become their greatest strengths. The reunion invitation, when it finally arrived, found Marcus in a very different place than the scared teenager who had once desperately wanted to fit in at Westfield High. Now he was someone who had built his own world, someone whose success was measured not by the approval of former classmates, but by the positive impact he was making on thousands of people through his company. When he saw that familiar golden embossing, Marcus didn't feel the old familiar twist in his stomach. Instead, he felt something much more powerful: curiosity. He was curious to see what had become of the people who had once seemed so important, so untouchable. He was curious to discover whether they had grown beyond their teenage selves, or whether they were still living in the same small world that had once felt like the entire universe. Most of all, he was curious to see whether they would recognize the person he had become. 3 years after graduating from Stanford, Marcus Chin stood on the 47th floor of a San Francisco skyscraper, looking out at a city that had become his kingdom. FixFlow now occupied 3 full floors of the building, employed 180 people, and processed over 50,000 service requests monthly across 23 states. But Marcus had learned that success in Silicon Valley wasn't measured by your first company. It was measured by your ability to build an entire ecosystem of innovation. The acquisition offers for FixFlow had started coming in seriously during year 2. Major corporations wanted to add Marcus's platform to their existing service portfolios, offering valuations that would have made him wealthy enough to retire at 25. But Marcus had turned down every offer, not because they weren't generous enough, but because he wasn't building a company to sell. He was building a foundation for something much larger. His vision had evolved beyond property maintenance into what he called service intelligence, the application of technology and data analytics to optimize any industry where service providers connected with customers. FixFlow was just the first piece of a puzzle that would eventually revolutionize everything from home repairs to healthcare to professional services. Marcus had spent the past year systematically expanding his expertise beyond technology into the broader skills required to build a business empire. He had enrolled in executive leadership courses at Wharton, studied under mentors who had built billion-dollar companies, and surrounded himself with advisors who understood not just how to create successful businesses, but how to create sustainable competitive advantages that could last for decades. The second company in what Marcus privately called his service ecosystem launched quietly in the spring of his 3rd year out of Stanford. ServiceFlow focused on professional services, connecting clients with lawyers, accountants, consultants, and other knowledge workers through a platform that emphasized transparency, accountability, and results tracking. While FixFlow had proven that technology could improve blue-collar service delivery, ServiceFlow would demonstrate that the same principles could revolutionize white-collar professional services. Marcus had learned from his experience with FixFlow that timing was everything in building a successful platform. He spent months studying the professional services market, identifying inefficiencies, and building relationships with potential early adopters before ever writing his first line of code. When ServiceFlow launched, it already had partnerships with 3 major law firms and 2 accounting practices who were eager to pilot a system that could streamline their client management and improve their service delivery. But building multiple companies simultaneously required a different kind of leadership than Marcus had needed when FixFlow was his only focus. He had to learn to delegate effectively, to hire executives who could run day-to-day operations while he focused on strategy and vision. More importantly, he had to develop the personal presence and communication skills that would make investors, partners, and employees want to follow his vision even when that vision required them to take significant risks. Marcus invested heavily in developing these skills. He hired an executive coach who had worked with Fortune 500 CEOs, took public speaking courses, and began accepting more speaking engagements at industry conferences. The shy teenager who had once struggled to defend himself against high school bullies was transforming into someone who could command attention and respect in rooms full of the most successful people in Silicon Valley. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Marcus began working with a personal trainer, upgrading his wardrobe, and developing the kind of sophisticated personal style that communicated success without ostentation. He wasn't trying to become someone else. He was becoming the best possible version of himself. Every change was strategic, designed to ensure that when he walked into any room, people would immediately understand that he belonged there. His social life evolved as well. Marcus began dating more seriously, developing relationships with successful women who shared his ambition and understood the demands of building multiple companies simultaneously. He bought a beautiful home in Pacific Heights, started collecting art, and began hosting dinner parties where entrepreneurs, investors, and industry leaders would gather to discuss the future of technology and business. These weren't shallow status symbols. They were tools for building the kind of network that could support increasingly ambitious projects. Marcus had learned that in Silicon Valley, relationships were often more valuable than technology, and he was systematically building relationships with people who could help him achieve goals that were still years in the future. By his fourth year out of Stanford, Marcus was operating at a level that would have been incomprehensible to his teenage self. FixFlow had been acquired by a Fortune 500 company for $127 million. But Marcus had structured the deal to maintain operational control while gaining access to resources and distribution channels that would have taken years to build independently. ServiceFlow had raised $15 million in series of funding and was expanding into 3 new markets. But Marcus's biggest achievement was the launch of Chun Ventures, his investment fund focused on early-stage companies that were applying technology to traditional service industries. The fund had raised $50 million from institutional investors and family offices, giving Marcus the capital to back other entrepreneurs who shared his vision of using technology to create efficiency and accountability in previously analog industries. Running an investment fund required Marcus to develop yet another set of skills. He had to learn to evaluate not just business models and technology platforms, but the personalities and capabilities of the entrepreneurs who would execute those visions. He had to understand market timing, competitive dynamics, and the complex relationships between different players in various industries. More importantly, he had to develop the judgment to know which risks were worth taking and which opportunities to pass on. Marcus invested in 12 companies during the fund's first year, ranging from a platform that connected freelance graphic designers with small businesses to a system that helped restaurants optimize their supply chains. Each investment required him to use everything he had learned about building companies, managing teams, and creating sustainable competitive advantages. The success of Chun Ventures had an unexpected side effect. It made Marcus a public figure in Silicon Valley in a way that running his own companies never had. When you're investing other people's money, your decisions become news, your opinions become influential, and your success or failure becomes a matter of public record. Marcus found himself being quoted in tech publications, invited to serve on industry panels, and asked to comment on trends and developments throughout the technology sector. This public profile led to opportunities Marcus hadn't anticipated. He was invited to join the board of directors for a major nonprofit organization focused on improving educational opportunities for underserved communities. He was asked to serve as a guest lecturer at Stanford's Business School, teaching courses on entrepreneurship and venture capital. Most significantly, he was invited to join the Young Presidents Organization, an exclusive network of successful executives under 45 who were leading companies with significant revenues or employees. Each of these opportunities reinforced Marcus's transformation from an outsider desperately seeking acceptance to an insider who was actively shaping the communities he belonged to. He wasn't just successful. He was influential, respected, and genuinely valued for his insights and expertise. But perhaps the most important development during this period was Marcus's growing sense of purpose beyond his own success. His experiences with discrimination and bullying during high school had given him a deep empathy for other outsiders and underdogs. He began using his platform and resources to support initiatives that helped other people who faced similar challenges. Marcus became a major donor to organizations that supported Asian American entrepreneurs, understanding from his own experience how cultural barriers could prevent talented people from accessing opportunities in Silicon Valley. He funded scholarship programs for first-generation college students, knowing how transformative education could be for people who didn't come from privileged backgrounds. Most importantly, he began mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded him of his younger self, brilliant, driven people who faced skepticism and discrimination because they didn't fit traditional patterns of Silicon Valley success. These philanthropic activities weren't just about giving back. They were about using his success to create the kind of opportunities for others that he had been forced to create for himself. Marcus understood that his transformation from high school outcast to Silicon Valley success story was partly the result of exceptional circumstances and his own determination, but also partly the result of luck and timing that not everyone would have. By using his resources to support other outsiders and underdogs, Marcus was ensuring that his success would create ripple effects that extended far beyond his own companies and investments. He was building a legacy that would be measured not just by his personal achievements, but by the opportunities he created for other people to achieve their own transformations. As his 5th year out of Stanford approached, Marcus had built something that went far beyond what he had originally imagined when he first decided to transform himself. He wasn't just a successful entrepreneur or investor. He was a significant figure in Silicon Valley's ecosystem, someone whose opinions mattered, whose support could make the difference between success and failure for early-stage companies, whose story inspired other people who had faced similar challenges. The reunion invitation, when it arrived, found Marcus in a position of strength that he could barely have imagined during his darkest moments at Westfield High. He had built multiple successful companies, managed hundreds of millions of dollars in investments, and established himself as a leader in one of the world's most competitive industries. More importantly, he had created a version of himself that was genuinely confident, genuinely accomplished, and genuinely at peace with who he had become. When Marcus read the invitation, he didn't feel the old familiar anxiety or anger. Instead, he felt something he had never expected to feel about his high school classmates: curiosity. He was curious about who they had become, what they had accomplished, whether they had grown beyond the narrow worldview that had made them so cruel to anyone who was different. He was also curious about how they would react to seeing what he had become, not because he needed their approval or wanted their praise, but because he was genuinely interested in whether people could change, whether the bullies and bystanders of high school could evolve into better versions of themselves. But, more than anything, Marcus was curious about whether returning to Westfield would help him understand how far he had actually come. Sometimes, when you're focused on building the future, you lose track of the distance you've traveled from the past. The reunion represented an opportunity to measure that distance, to see his transformation from the outside, to understand exactly what he had accomplished during the years since he had walked out of Westfield High swearing never to look back. Marcus RSVP'd to the reunion with the same careful consideration he applied to major business decisions. He wasn't going back to prove anything to his former classmates. He had already proven everything he needed to prove to himself. He was going back because he was finally secure enough in who he had become to face who he had once been, and curious enough about human nature to see what had happened to the people who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable. The decision to attend the reunion wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about completion, the final chapter in a transformation that had taken him from the margins of high school society to the center of one of the world's most influential industries. It was time to see how that story looked from the perspective of the people who had been there when it began. The decision to attend the reunion was one thing. Deciding how to attend was something entirely different. Marcus Chun spent 3 weeks considering his options, approaching the problem with the same strategic thinking he applied to major business decisions. This wasn't about making an entrance. It was about making a statement, and statements required careful planning. His first instinct was to simply drive up from San Francisco in his Tesla Model S, the same way any successful Silicon Valley executive might travel to a social event. But as Marcus thought more about the psychology of the situation, he realized that subtle displays of success might be lost on people who were still operating with the same mindset they had possessed in high school. His former classmates needed to understand immediately and unmistakably that the person walking into their reunion was not the same person they had once bullied and dismissed. The idea for the helicopter came to him during a business trip to Los Angeles, where he had taken a helicopter transfer from LAX to a meeting in Orange County. As the aircraft lifted off and the city spread out below him, Marcus realized that most people never experience this kind of mobility, this sense of being literally above the ordinary constraints of traffic and geography. For his former classmates, who had probably never left their comfortable suburban bubble, the sight of someone arriving by helicopter would be instantly recognizable as a symbol of extraordinary success. But Marcus wanted more than just a symbol. He wanted authenticity. A private helicopter charter for the occasion would be impressive, but it would also be temporary, borrowed. Marcus wanted to arrive in something that belonged to him, something that represented not just wealth, but the kind of life he had actually built. That's when he remembered Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was a decorated Army pilot who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq before transitioning to civilian life as a helicopter instructor and charter service operator. Marcus had met her through his veteran support nonprofit work, and they had developed both a professional relationship and a genuine friendship. Sarah owned a meticulously maintained AH-64 Apache helicopter that she used for air shows, military demonstrations, and very exclusive charter services for clients who needed to make exactly the kind of impression Marcus was contemplating. The Apache wasn't just a helicopter. It was a $35 million piece of military hardware that represented power, precision, and the kind of resources that were available only to institutions and individuals at the very highest levels of society. Having Sarah pilot him to the reunion in her Apache would send a message that went far beyond simple wealth. It would demonstrate that Marcus now moved in circles where such resources were available to him, where decorated military officers were his personal friends and business partners. Marcus called Sarah on a Tuesday evening and explained the situation without going into too much detail about his high school experiences. Sarah, who had dealt with her own challenges as a woman in a male-dominated military culture, understood immediately what Marcus was trying to accomplish. You want to show them that the person they underestimated has access to resources they can't even imagine, she said with the direct communication style that Marcus had come to appreciate about her. And you want to do it in a way that makes it impossible for them to ignore or rationalize away what they're seeing. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. But I also want it to be authentic. I'm not trying to pretend to be someone I'm not. I am someone who has built relationships with people like you, someone who operates at a level where chartering an Apache for a personal event is unusual, but not impossible. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the request. I've been looking for an opportunity to do some publicity for the charter service. Having photographs of the Apache at a civilian social event with the right kind of story behind it could be valuable marketing material. And frankly, I like the idea of helping someone turn the tables on bullies. They spent the next hour working out the logistics. The reunion was being held at the Westfield Country Club, which had a large parking lot that could easily accommodate a helicopter landing. Sarah would need to file a flight plan and get permission from local air traffic control, but as a licensed charter operator with perfect safety records, those approvals would be routine. The timing would be crucial. Marcus wanted to arrive after the reunion had officially started, when most of his former classmates would already be at the venue, but not so late that his entrance would completely disrupt the event. Marcus spent the following weeks preparing for the reunion with the same attention to detail he brought to major product launches. He researched each of his former classmates through social media, LinkedIn, and public records, not because he was planning to confront anyone specifically, but because he wanted to understand the context he would be walking into. What he found was largely what he had expected. Most of his former tormentors were leading comfortable but unremarkable lives in or near Westfield, following predictable paths through local colleges, conventional careers, and suburban domesticity. Brad Hutchinson, his primary nemesis from high school, had graduated from a regional state university with a business degree and was now a manager at his father's construction company. His social media posts showed a life of recreational activities, golf, fishing, local sports events, but no evidence of particular ambition or achievement beyond the comfortable existence his family connections had provided. He had married his high school girlfriend, lived in a large house in the same neighborhood where he had grown up, and seemed to view his high school years as the peak of his social influence. Most of the other classmates followed similar patterns. They had remained in their familiar geographic and social circles, pursuing careers that were respectable but not exceptional, living lives that were pleasant but not particularly consequential. Very few had ventured beyond the boundaries of their known world, and even fewer had achieved anything that could be considered remarkable by external standards. Marcus felt no satisfaction in this discovery, only a kind of anthropological interest. These people had seemed so powerful and important during high school because high school had been the extent of their world. They had been the rulers of a very small kingdom, and most of them had never attempted to expand their domain beyond its original borders. As the reunion date approached, Marcus began receiving calls and emails from classmates who had seen his RSVP and wanted to catch up before the event. These communications had a strange quality to them, a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and what seemed like genuine surprise that he was planning to attend. Several people mentioned that they had tried to find him on social media over the years, apparently not realizing that successful executives often maintained limited online presence to protect their privacy and professional reputations. Marcus responded politely but briefly to these overtures, confirming his attendance but providing no details about his current life or accomplishments. He wanted his former classmates to approach the reunion with the same assumptions they had always held about him, so that the contrast with reality would be as stark as possible. 2 days before the reunion, Marcus received an unexpected call from Mrs. Rodriguez, his former chemistry teacher who had tried to protect him from Brad's harassment during their junior year project. Mrs. Rodriguez, now retired, had heard that Marcus was planning to attend the reunion and wanted to express how proud she was of his success. She had followed his career through Stanford alumni publications and tech industry news, and she wanted him to know that she had always believed he would accomplish extraordinary things. "I want you to know," she told him, "that watching students like you succeed makes all the difficult parts of teaching worthwhile. You were always special, Marcus, even when other people couldn't see it." The conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez helped Marcus clarify his intentions for the reunion. He wasn't returning to seek revenge against people who had been cruel to him or to prove his superiority over people who had dismissed him. He was returning to complete a circle, to demonstrate to himself and others that transformation was possible, that the judgments people made about each other in high school were often completely wrong, and that authentic success came from developing your genuine capabilities rather than conforming to other people's expectations. On the morning of the reunion, Marcus woke up in his San Francisco home, feeling calm and focused. He had chosen his outfit carefully. A perfectly tailored navy suit from Seville Row Tailor, handmade Italian shoes, a simple but expensive watch that wouldn't immediately scream wealth, but would be recognizable to anyone who understood luxury goods. He looked successful but not flashy, confident but not arrogant, like exactly what he was, a person who had earned his place in the world through intelligence, hard work, and strategic thinking. Sarah arrived at the private airfield south of San Francisco at exactly 2 p.m., as planned. The Apache sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its matte black finish and angular design radiating the kind of controlled power that made civilian helicopters look like toys in comparison. Sarah had polished every surface until it gleamed, and the aircraft looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line at Boeing's Defense Division. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked as she completed her pre-flight inspection. "Once we land this thing at Country Club in suburban Westfield, there's no taking it back. Everyone's going to remember exactly where you were the day you decided to make a statement." Marcus smiled, feeling completely certain for the first time since he had received the reunion invitation. "That's exactly the point. I spent 4 years of high school trying to be invisible, trying not to attract attention, hoping people would just leave me alone. I think it's time for me to be seen. As the Apache lifted off from the airfield and turned north toward Westfield, Marcus looked down at the landscape he had once known so well. The highways he had traveled as a teenager, the suburbs where his former classmates still lived, the small world that had once seemed like everything and now looked like exactly what it was, just one small corner of a much larger universe. But more importantly, Marcus would finally see for himself how far he had traveled from the scared, isolated teenager he had once been. The reunion wasn't really about his former classmates at all. It was about completing his own transformation, about proving to himself that he had become someone who could face any situation with confidence and dignity. As the familiar landmarks of his hometown appeared on the horizon, Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. The Westfield Country Club's parking lot was packed with the luxury SUVs and sedans that had become the standard transportation for successful suburban families. BMW X5S, Mercedes GL classes, and Audi Q7S gleamed under the late afternoon sun, representing the comfortable prosperity that defined this particular corner of American success. Inside the clubhouse, the class of 2014's 10-year reunion was in full swing, with 127 of the original 184 graduates mingling in the main ballroom, sharing stories and updates about their lives since graduation. Marcus Chun could see all of this through the Apache's advanced targeting system as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell brought them in for their final approach. The helicopter's sophisticated electronics allowed him to observe the scene below with remarkable detail. Small groups of former classmates clustered around cocktail tables, people posing for photos near the reunion banner, couples dancing to music from their teenage years. It looked exactly like what it was, a gathering of people who had lived comfortable, conventional lives and were celebrating the fact that most things had worked out pretty much as they had expected. 30 seconds out, Sarah announced through the intercom, "You ready for this?" Marcus adjusted his tie and checked his reflection in the Apache's instrument panel. He looked exactly like what he was, a successful Silicon Valley executive who happened to have access to military-grade transportation. "I've been ready for this for 10 years. The sound hit the country club before the helicopter became visible. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades echoed across the manicured grounds, growing louder and more insistent until conversations inside the ballroom began to falter. People stopped dancing, stopped talking, and moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the parking lot. Within seconds, the entire reunion had pressed against the glass, watching in amazement as a genuine military attack helicopter settled onto the asphalt with mechanical precision. Sarah executed the landing flawlessly, touching down in the center of the parking lot with barely a vibration. The Apache's engines wound down gradually, the rotor blades slowing to a stop as a crowd began to gather outside the clubhouse. Marcus could see his former classmates emerging from the building, their faces showing mixtures of confusion, excitement, and dawning recognition as they realized that someone from their graduating class had just arrived in a $35 million piece of military hardware. "Showtime," Sarah said, shutting down the final systems and removing her helmet. "Remember, I'll be staying with the aircraft. You handle the social situation, however, feels right to you." Marcus stepped out of the Apache with the same calm confidence he brought to boardroom presentations. The helicopter's door closed behind him with a solid thunk that seemed to echo across the suddenly quiet parking lot. Every person in the crowd was staring at him, trying to reconcile their memories of the quiet, awkward teenager they had once known with the impeccably dressed executive who had just emerged from a military aircraft. The first person to approach him was Jennifer Walsh, who had been student council president and was now, according to Marcus's research, a marketing coordinator for a regional healthcare company. She walked toward him with the kind of careful smile people use when they're not quite sure what they're dealing with. "Marcus? Marcus Chun? Oh my God, I can't believe you came. And is that a real military helicopter?" "Hello, Jennifer. Yes, it's an Apache. And yes, it's real." Marcus's voice was calm, friendly, but completely lacking the deference that Jennifer and others might have expected from their memories of him. "Sarah Mitchell is the pilot. She's a decorated veteran and runs a charter service for special occasions. More classmates began to gather around him, their conversations a mixture of genuine excitement and barely concealed amazement. Marcus recognized most of them, though many had changed significantly in the years since graduation. Some had gained weight, others had lost hair, and almost all of them carried themselves with a slightly settled demeanor of people who had found their place in the world and stopped striving for anything extraordinary. "Dude, Marcus, this is insane," said Kevin Torres, who had played basketball and now worked as a loan officer at a regional bank. "How did you even, who charters a military helicopter for a high school reunion? Someone who built a successful business and wanted to make sure he didn't get stuck in traffic," Marcus replied with a slight smile. The 101 can be brutal on Saturday evenings. Brad Hutchinson appeared at the edge of the crowd, and Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that he had experienced for years whenever he saw his former tormentor. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by something that surprised him: pity. Brad had aged badly. His golden boy looks softened by too much comfort and too little challenge. His expensive golf shirt and khakis looked exactly like what they were, the uniform of someone who had never needed to compete beyond the boundaries of his father's business and his father's social circle. Well, Brad said with the same smirk he had worn throughout high school. "Marcus Chun, I have to admit, I never expected to see you here, especially not arriving like some kind of action movie star." The crowd went quiet, sensing the tension between the two men. Marcus looked at Brad for a long moment, remembering the years of casual cruelty, the systematic humiliation, the way this person had made his teenage years a daily exercise in survival. But instead of anger, Marcus felt only a profound sense of distance, as if he were looking at Brad through the wrong end of a telescope. "Hello, Brad. You look exactly the same." It wasn't an insult, exactly, but something in Marcus's tone made it clear that looking exactly the same wasn't necessarily a compliment. Brad's smirk faltered slightly, and Marcus continued before he could respond. "I'm sure everyone's curious about what I've been doing since graduation. After Stanford, I founded a company called Fix Flow that revolutionized property maintenance services. We scaled to 23 states before I sold it to a Fortune 500 company. Then, I founded Service Flow, which applies similar technology to professional services. I also run an investment fund called Chun Ventures, which has about $50 million under management and focuses on early-stage technology companies." The crowd was completely silent now. Marcus wasn't boasting. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were reading from a resume. But the numbers were staggering to people who measured success in terms of comfortable suburban lifestyles and steady paychecks. "I serve on the board of 3 nonprofit organizations, guest lecturer at Stanford's Business School, and was recently inducted into the Young Presidents Organization. Forbes profiled me as one of Silicon Valley's rising leaders under 30, and TechCrunch called Service Flow one of the most innovative platforms in the professional services space." Marcus paused, looking around at the faces of his former classmates. They were listening with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for emergency announcements or winning lottery numbers. These were people who had thought they understood the world, who had believed that success came from following conventional paths and fitting into existing social structures. The idea that the person they had dismissed and bullied had achieved this level of success was clearly challenging their fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. "But enough about me," Marcus continued. "I'm much more interested in hearing about what all of you have been doing. Jennifer, I heard you're in marketing now. That's wonderful. Kevin, loan officer at First National, right? And Brad?" Marcus looked directly at his former tormentor. "Still working for your father's company, I assume?" Brad's face flushed red. "It's a family business. Someone has to carry on the tradition. Of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Stability, tradition, staying close to home. These are all valuable choices." Marcus's tone was completely sincere, which somehow made his words even more devastating. Not everyone needs to build something new. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at Marcus's elbow, having apparently driven to the country club specifically to see him. Her face was beaming with pride and genuine affection. "Marcus, I'm so proud of you. When I heard you were coming, I had to drive over to see you myself." Marcus's entire demeanor softened as he turned to greet his former teacher. "Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you so much for coming. You know, your chemistry class was one of the things that first got me interested in systematic problem solving. In many ways, everything I've built since then started in your classroom." The conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez lasted several minutes, during which Marcus's former classmates had time to process what they were witnessing. The person they remembered as weak and vulnerable was now clearly the most successful person in their graduating class, possibly the most successful person ever to graduate from Westfield High. More importantly, he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that couldn't be faked or borrowed, the assurance of someone who had tested himself against the highest standards and proven he belonged at that level. When Mrs. Rodriguez finally excused herself, Marcus turned back to the crowd of classmates who were still gathered around him. "I should probably head inside and see who else is here. It's been 10 years since I've seen most of you." As they walked toward the clubhouse, Marcus noticed how the group dynamics had shifted. People who had barely acknowledged his existence in high school were now trying to engage him in conversation, asking about his companies, his experiences at Stanford, his life in San Francisco. Former popular kids who had once treated him like a social pariah were now competing for his attention, clearly recognizing that he had achieved something extraordinary. Inside the ballroom, Marcus's entrance created a ripple effect that spread through the entire reunion. Conversations stopped as people recognized him. Whispered explanations were shared. "Did you see him arrive in a helicopter?" And within minutes, everyone at the reunion knew that Marcus Chun, quiet, awkward Marcus Chun, who had eaten lunch alone for 4 years, was now extraordinarily successful. The reunion's organizers, led by Ashley Morrison, formerly Ashley Patterson, the cheerleading captain, approached Marcus with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for celebrity appearances. "Marcus, we had no idea you were going to be here. Would you be willing to say a few words to everyone? I mean, arriving in a helicopter, that's definitely a first for a Westfield reunion." Marcus considered the request. He could easily decline, simply enjoy the rest of the evening as a private guest, let his presence speak for itself. But something about the eager faces around him, about the way his former classmates were looking at him with new respect and curiosity, made him realize that he had an opportunity to do something more meaningful than simply demonstrate his success. "I'd be happy to say a few words," he replied. "But I should warn you, I might not give the speech you're expecting." Ashley quickly arranged for the DJ to pause the music and for a microphone to be brought to the small stage at the front of the ballroom. The crowd gathered around expectantly, clearly anticipating some kind of victory speech or inspirational message about achieving the American dream. Marcus took the microphone and looked out at the faces of his former classmates, people who had shared 4 of the most formative years of his life, people who had taught him lessons about cruelty and kindness that had shaped everything he had accomplished since. When he spoke, his voice was calm and thoughtful. "Thank you for asking me to speak. I have to admit, 10 years ago, I never imagined I would be standing here, addressing all of you. Not because I didn't think I'd be successful, but because I genuinely believed I would never want to see any of you again." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. This wasn't starting like a typical reunion speech. High school was not a happy time for me. Many of you probably don't remember this, but I was bullied pretty consistently during my time at Westfield. I was different. I looked different, my family's circumstances were different, my interests were different, and in this environment, being different was treated like a character flaw that needed to be corrected or punished. The ballroom was completely quiet now. Marcus could see Brad Hutchinson near the back, his face pale and uncomfortable. For a long time, I carried a lot of anger about those experiences. I used that anger as motivation to succeed, to prove that the people who dismissed me were wrong about my potential. And in many ways, that anger served me well. It gave me the determination to work harder than anyone else, to take risks that others wouldn't take, to build something extraordinary out of my life. Marcus paused, looking around the room at faces that were now showing genuine attention and, in some cases, discomfort. But here's what I learned that I want to share with all of you. Success that's built on anger doesn't actually feel like success. It feels like postponed revenge. And revenge, even when it's perfectly justified, doesn't make you happy. It just makes you powerful enough to hurt other people the way they once hurt you. The silence in the room was profound now. This was clearly not what anyone had expected to hear. So, I want to say something that might surprise you. I forgive you. All of you. The people who were actively cruel, the people who stood by and watched, even the people who were kind to me, but didn't have the courage to defend me when others weren't. I forgive you because carrying anger about high school into your 30s is like letting teenagers control your adult life, and I refuse to give anyone that much power over my happiness. Marcus could see people wiping away tears, could see others looking down at their feet in apparent shame or reflection. But I also want to say this. Forgiveness doesn't mean that actions don't have consequences. The way you treated people who were different, who were vulnerable, who couldn't defend themselves, that revealed something about your character that was worth paying attention to. Some of you have probably grown since then, become better people, learned to treat others with kindness and respect. If so, I'm genuinely happy for you and proud of the growth you've achieved. But some of you probably haven't changed much. Some of you probably still think that success is about fitting in rather than standing out, that leadership is about popularity rather than competence, that other people's differences are threats to be eliminated rather than strengths to be celebrated. If that describes you, then I want you to understand something. The world has moved on without you. The qualities that made you popular in high school are largely irrelevant in the adult world, while the qualities that made people like me outcasts in high school are exactly what drives success in the real world. Marcus set down a microphone and looked around the room one final time. I didn't come here tonight to humiliate anyone or to prove my superiority. I came here to complete a circle, to show myself and all of you that transformation is possible, that the judgments we make about each other when we're 17 years old are often completely wrong, and that authentic success comes from developing your genuine capabilities rather than conforming to other people's expectations. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the lessons you taught me, both the ones you intended and the ones you didn't. Marcus handed the microphone back to Ashley and walked toward the exit, stopping to shake hands with several classmates who approached him with what appeared to be genuine respect and, in some cases, apologies. He spoke briefly with Mrs. Rodriguez, who hugged him tightly and told him how proud she was not just of his success, but of the man he had become. As he walked back toward the Apache, Marcus could hear the reunion slowly resuming behind him. Conversations restarting, music beginning again, people processing what they had just witnessed. But he didn't look back. He had said everything he needed to say, proven everything he needed to prove, and completed the transformation he had begun 10 years earlier. Sarah had the helicopter ready for takeoff, and within minutes they were airborne again, the lights of the country club falling away below them as they headed back toward San Francisco. As the familiar landscape of his childhood disappeared behind them, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: peace. Not the satisfaction of victory or the relief of revenge, but the simple peace that comes from knowing you have become exactly who you were meant to be. How do you feel? Sarah asked through the intercom. Marcus considered the question as they flew through the darkening sky toward his real life, his real home, his real future. Like I finally finished something I started a long time ago, he replied. And like I'm ready to start something new. Below them, the lights of Silicon Valley appeared on the horizon, marking the boundary of a world where intelligence was valued over popularity, where innovation mattered more than conformity, where outsiders became leaders and different became better. Marcus was heading home to that world, carrying with him the knowledge that he had faced his past without bitterness and emerged with his future intact. The helicopter carrying him away from his 10-year reunion wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of how far a person could travel when they refused to let other people's limitations define their possibilities. And as the Apache disappeared into the California night, it left behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of their lives remembering the night they realized they had completely misjudged the quiet kid who used to eat lunch alone.